Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL Week 1 overview and analysis video, and then of course at the end, my updated power rankings. Incredibly excited to get into this. The NACL is my favorite league to cover. I've been pretty vocal about that on this channel. Every single week, NACL is a blast to watch and a blast to make content about in general. And speaking of making content on the NACL, obviously those of you who are watching this video know that I make weekly NACL content here on this channel, but what I didn't really advertise, what I'm going to start doing is streaming some of the games and commentating over them, you know, kind of giving my thoughts, a little bit of early analysis on some of what we're going to be seeing. I'm not going to be able to do it every single day of the NACL, but I will be streaming on my Twitch channel. The link to that's going to be in the description. If you want to give that a follow, you can be notified when those streams do go live if you want to watch along with me. Of course, if you want to just watch the recap videos, you can get those updates, you know, at the end of every week or right before all the games go out. That's fine as well, but I figured I would let you guys know that I'm starting to do that over on Twitch, so go ahead and head over there if you are interested. But we're here to cover week number 1, the week that already did happen. Did watch a couple of these series live, so I'll be talking about that as we go through these videos. I've given quite a few thoughts on them already, but we will be covering all 15 series from week number 1 in this video. So if you're excited, let me know down in the comment section below who over-exceeded your expectations, who underperformed your expectations in week number 1. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on pretty much everything that's going on in the league. Of course, you'll hear my thoughts as we go throughout this video, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into week 1, day number 1. And it's going to be the same format as last year, this more scoreboard style approach. I don't want to go super in-depth, especially now that I'm watching a lot of the games live. I'm giving a lot of coverage of the NACL every single week, and so I'm going to be kind of speeding through this. Hopefully this video is around about an hour. That would be the dream if I could get it to that point. I've been trying to make these videos shorter. I know you guys are tired of the hour and a half, 2-hour long videos, but man, I can't help with the LPL. There's just so many games, but for the NACL, let's go ahead and start talking about day number 1. And we kicked off day number 1 in the split in general here in summer with a matchup between AoE Gold and Wildcard Gaming that they did split one apiece. AoE taking game 1, Wildcard taking game number 2. Pretty good showing, I would say, from both teams in their respective games. There were definitely positives and negatives. I think the positives, at least starting with a team like Wildcard, this is the exact same team that they were in spring, and that's going to make a lot of people happy. The eccentric picks are back. They're not going to calm down with Zamudo in the top lane. He's still going to continue to be a crazy, crazy player to have to play into and to try and prep for, especially as we saw in game number 1 with him pulling out the Karthus top. I mean, actually absurd into Garen. Like, only in the NACL are you really ever going to see that matchup, but even if it didn't quite work out in game number 1, although there were moments where it looked good. He was pretty good in game number 2. I think that there were good moments for Wildcard, but overall, I would say that AoE honestly looked like the better team in this series, which is really good to see. These two teams I had clumped kind of together in terms of what I expected the output to be. They were kind of, you know, back and forth in terms of my power rankings. Put one over the other, you know, wasn't a huge difference for me, so to see them split isn't surprising, but my player of the series, as you can see there, is going to go to Lynx in the bot lane. Thought he really showed a lot, and that's going to be a really, really big thing, I would say, for AoE overall. Obviously, we know that this team has a lot of upside, especially if the jungle mid duo can get it together with Will and Darkwings, but Lynx is a really good player, and Breezy is a pretty solid player. Like, they're going to be able to kind of push this tempo forward, especially if Lynx takes that next step up. I thought he was really consistent across this entire series, and I think he, you know, was probably the best player in the series overall, which is why he gets my player of the series. Big shout out to Breezy as well, who I thought did play well. Now, the player who I thought didn't play well on AoE is actually going to be Darkwings, and that's really only game 2. He had a really good game number 1. Pretty much everybody on AoE played well in game number 1, but game number 2 was not all that great from Darkwings, and he'll have games like this every once in a while. I'm not going to, you know, hate on him as a player. You're allowed to have one bad game every once in a while, but it is worth noting that he was kind of outplayed at least a little bit by Saligo and by Wildcard in game number 2, so definitely something to keep in mind. But if the bot lane steps up and plays like they did here, it's not going to be a huge problem. And then for Wildcard on the other side, unfortunately, they're going to get my dud of the series here, which is going to go to Duo King in the support positions. You know, he's going to be filling in for, at the very least, the beginning part of the year for Isles. I'm not exactly sure how long that might be. It might be the entire split. We don't really know, but we know what Duo King is as a player, and sometimes he's just going to have bad games, and that's what game 1 was. I think it was the worst individual game this series from a player. You just can't go 0-6 on Milio. Like, you have to have some impact on the game overall, and it just didn't didn't feel like that bot lane was winning really at any point in that game number 1, which was the big problem. But like I said earlier, the positive from this team, in my opinion, is Zamudo in the top lane, who actually looked really good across this series. Obviously, people are going to talk about the Karthus, but his game 2, where they were able to take it, was incredibly consistent, and I thought he was probably the best performing member of that wildcard team. And so both of them, you know, these teams kind of looking exactly how we expected them to. Wildcard being a team that's going to pull out some crazy things, but is going to be a little bit more feast or famine, and AoE definitely going to rely on more consistent play to be able to get themselves ahead, but AoE was a lot more consistent in this series, and I think that's something that I value overall. And then moving on to our other opening series here of day number 1, we had a matchup that I was really looking forward to. Two teams that I was hyping up a lot going into the split. We had Cincinnati Fear taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and it was close. It certainly wasn't a complete blowout, but FlyQuest Challengers is going to be walking away with the 2-0 victory here, which is huge for this team. Obviously, a lot of people were talking about a big 3 in the NACL for this upcoming split. Of course, the big 3 being Team Liquid, Disguised, and FlyQuest, and I definitely think that, you know, Fly definitely showed up to that reputation early on. I had Fear right outside that big 3, and I honestly called it a big 4 for a bit in the preseason, but unfortunately, Fly just showing that they should not be underestimated at all, that they might be the number 1 team in the power rankings, that they really, you know, started to come on towards the back half of last year, of course, when Masu actually got off of ping and got to play the game, and that was big for them. They couldn't get it done in the playoffs, where I think a lot of people were expecting kind of a big run from them, but the summer split might be more of their speed. They were great in this series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Yuji in the jungle. He looked awesome in this series, and we were kind of talking about that in the preseason. We were talking about how Yuji and Spearex weren't exactly meshing together in spring nearly as much as you would want. It didn't feel like their playstyles matched really all that well. Yuji being a very aggressive jungler, Spearex not exactly following up in that same kind of way, but things did work out in this series. Now, Spearex wasn't perfect. We'll get to him in a bit, but I do think Yuji looked fantastic, and playing those aggressive carry type of champions, I think, is a big positive for him overall. That's a style that I expect this FlyQuest team to go back to even more, but Masu was also really good. Both Masu and Winsome, I called them the best bot lane in the NACL before the split started, and obviously, it's only one series, but it looks pretty damn good after the first series at the very least. They looked really solid at the beginning of this split, and they really could just descend into being so much better than everybody else that they play against, because that's kind of what happened in this series. And then unfortunately, I do have to point out Spearex, who wasn't perfect in this series. I don't think he was nearly as bad as some other people are giving him credit for. Some people are calling him, you know, the big weak link for this team, and I think that there is a possibility that that turns into a reality, but I certainly don't think that was a reality in this series. He wasn't being hard carried or anything like that. He just wasn't the one with the resources, and I definitely think that there were moments where he definitely didn't look as good. I think especially in game number 1, you're looking at that matchup against Shochi, and Shochi probably coming out on top, at least in terms of performance in that matchup, and I think that's definitely something to keep in mind for a team that doesn't have aspirations of being good and winning games, but has aspirations of being one of the best teams in the league. I think that's definitely something to keep in mind, but pretty much everybody else was there to pick up any slack that there was. I really don't even think it was that much, and so I think it was fine for FlyQuest overall. And then for Fear on the other side, definitely not the way you wanted to start out your split here, and we'll kind of get to that throughout the week, but not a great showing, in my opinion, from the new bot lane. You have Manui here, obviously returning from Fear, but you've got JJ coming in and replacing Trevor. I'm very excited about JJ. I like him a lot as a player, but it didn't exactly work out in this first series. I'm going to give dud of the series to Manui. I think he's still an incredibly talented player, but consistency has been something in the past, not only for him, but for this team, just in general, being able to take games off of teams that are really good, like FlyQuest has been, you know, a little bit up and down. There are moments where they look great, moments where they don't look as good, and I think this series kind of was that for this team. I do want to say that Shochi did look really good in game number 1, and there were a lot of moments on that Syndra where it felt like, oh, you know, one team fight going right, and they could absolutely just blow this game wide open. And I do also think that, you know, Perry had some moments in this series where he looked pretty alright, even going into a super fed jungler like Yuji was in this series, but overall, Fear just felt like they were on the back foot a lot of the time, and I think that's a credit to Fly. It's really not an anti-Fear thing. Fly's just a really good team, and I think they proved that a lot in this first series. And then moving on to our second slate of games there on day number 1, we had a matchup between two of the teams that were lower, I think, in a lot of other people's power rankings, and mine as well. We had Team Fish Taco taking on Supernova, and they do split one apiece, but it was not in the way where it's like, oh, these are the two bad teams going up against each other, and neither can really separate themselves. These were good games from two teams that I think showed a lot of promise on this first day, which is super good to see, because I really didn't want there to be a situation where there was like a bottom 3, bottom 2, 2 in the league. I wanted everybody to be relatively competitive, and especially narrowing down the talent pool to 10 teams instead of it being 16 like it was last split. I mean, the talent level is so congregated. These teams are not as separated as they were in spring, and so to see the teams that I think a lot of people predicted to not do as well put up really good fights against each other, I think is a really good sign overall, and there were a lot of positives to take away from this series. We're going to start with Supernova because I think that they were maybe a little bit more impressive in their win, and mostly because their player of the series is going to go to Sketch, who was just spectacular in this series for them. He's back in the AD carry position, he's back playing bot lane, and he looked phenomenal doing so. It's not like he was going into a bad bot lane. We'll talk about Spawn and NXI in a second. They were probably the best part of Taco as well on the other side, who I think, played admirably, especially in that game number 2, but Sketch looked terrific. He played really aggressive, he was willing to step up, make trades, deal damage. Like, this is what I wanted to see out of Sketch. Obviously, a lot of people have really liked him for a while, me included. I really liked him last year, and, just throughout his career, I think he's been an undervalued player. I just didn't exactly understand the role swap to support because it's a very feast or famine way to go about, scouting for your team. I think Taco obviously understands that now. They're feeling it in a good way. We'll get to that in a second, but I think Sketch definitely back in the bot lane role for Supernova could be a massive positive for this team, and when I was previewing them, I said that this bot lane is going to be the best part of this team and is very likely going to get them, the wins that they get throughout the split, and that was definitely the case in this first series. But I do also want to give a shout out to Music, who I think really did play well in game number 1 in that same vein. I talked about not really watching a lot of tape of his. Of all the players in the NACL, I was probably least familiar with him going into the split. I only got to watch about 3 or 4 games, which is much less than I watched on basically anybody else in this, and so I didn't exactly know what we were going to get, but he was really good in this first series. Honestly, just heavy out-jungled Rosethorn on the other side of the map. So Music, Sketch, definitely the winners for Supernova. Loser for Supernova, though, is going to be my dud of the series there in Quacker in the top lane. Just wasn't really all that impressed with his laning. Honestly, kind of got blown back in both games by Lunacia, and Lunacia is a really good laner. I'm not going to try to take that away from Quacker, but it just wasn't the super standout performance that I think I was kind of hoping for, especially when the rest of the team was performing really well in that game number 1. He wasn't quite as dominant as I think we were all kind of looking for. I don't think he was bad by any means. I don't think he ran it down or anything like that, but I think all 10 players in this series actually played pretty admirably, and so unfortunately somebody had to get it. And for me, I think consistency-wise, I was just a little bit more concerned with Quacker than I was with a player like Rosethorn, who was also in that conversation, but I think you could realistically give it to either. But talking about Taco on the other side, again, the bot lane was the big standout, especially in their win in game number 2, Spawn and NXI. NXI is so active. He's everywhere on the map, basically all the time. This is exactly what I wanted to see. Obviously, a jungler role swapping to support is a little bit different than a lot of the other roles we've seen, maybe mid laner or maybe AD carry. In recent years in North America, seen a lot of players switch from those roles into the support position. Jungle can really make for some interesting decisions because a jungler's first instinct is going to be to affect the lane that he feels like he can affect the most, and that's really what NXI did a lot of the series, was try to affect the map as much as possible. Obviously, him and Spawn worked together really well in the bot lane to be able to set things up in game number 2, but I was really impressed with NXI, and I was impressed with Spawn as well. I said he was the best player on this team going into the split, certainly the most consistent, and I think that definitely showed up in their first series. Still need to see at least a little bit more, but I thought he was good, and then, Rosethorn was very close to getting my dud of the series for that game number 1, but he actually had a pretty good game number 2, and so it was difficult for me to do that. Obviously, these best of 2s make it very difficult for a dud of the series because usually these players will play well in at least one of the games, and 50-50, that's kind of a difficult dud of the series choice, but Rosethorn definitely would have been the one, in my opinion, on the side of Taco. I think Music just outplayed him, especially in that game number 1, and I think it was definitely a little bit more noticeable, but overall, I would say both of these teams relatively impressed, and I'm excited to see where both of them go for this split. And then our second period game here, as we have the matchup of the day, at least on the first day here, the one that I think most people were most excited about, Disguised taking on Team Liquid Challengers in their NACL debut. This was a very publicized move, I guess, for Disguised Toast to join the NACL, to join the League of Legends scene, and to really invest a lot and to get a team that was really, really good on paper. And at least in the first series, there was a lot of good and a lot of bad to come with that, and really, they should not be ashamed of that. I had Team Liquid as the number 1 team in my power rankings going into this split. I had them as my predicted champions of the summer split, or at least going into it, the team that I felt the most confident in. And even though it was a little bit of a blowout in game number 2, I still think Disguised absolutely held their own and looked pretty good in this circumstance. This might have been been a battle between the two best teams in the NACL right now, and I think both came out looking relatively good. My player of the series is going to go to APA. Thought he looked really, really fantastic. There's a reason I called him the clear-cut #1 mid laner in the NACL, and that's because everybody else has question marks, right? Like, you can look at, players who have been around this level for a while and have just consistently been good, like Ryoma and like Saligo, who have just been pretty solid. You can look at up-and-coming, new mid laners who have the potential to break out, like Shochi, like Spirax that we already talked about. But I think what you're getting with APA is kind of the combination of both of them. Obviously, APA not spent a ton of time at this level, but he's been fantastic at the amateur level for a crazy long time. Somebody who has been hyped up for years and years and years as somebody who would succeed very, very quickly at this level. And then he finally got the chance on a good organization in Team Liquid, and he did just that. He was the best mid laner in the region in spring, and there's a reason that I feel pretty confident that he's going to be able to push this team forward. He looked great in this first series. I also want to give a big shout out to the bot lane here of Arrow and Kim Down, who also looked really, really good. If they're going to be able to keep that up and just kind of play off the rest of the map relatively consistently, this team is going to be just fine, in my opinion. But APA, the star of Team Liquid, in my opinion, and definitely showed it in this first series. And then you've got Disguised. While I think they did look good, I think there were moments where they didn't look as good, especially in that game #2. I think my dud of the series is going to go to Meech in the bot lane. I'm lower on Meech, and I know that I am, and I've been public about the fact that I am, than I think a lot of other NACL analysts. Not by a lot. I still think he's a top, 4-ish bot laner in the NACL, but I've been seeing people crown him as a top, 2, top 1 even bot laner in the NACL. I'm just not ready to make that leap yet. He still has quite a few inconsistencies that I don't think the best players at this elo have. The talent is obviously there, as we saw in game #1, which was pretty good from him, but that game #2 was really inconsistent. And, if he's going to be playing this more like strong side style that Disguised really seems to want to play in the bot lane, he's going to need to step up. He might be the most important player to this team overall. And then I also think Fake God and Zazel weren't like particularly great. Fake God was so active in fighting, and that's not really been his style over the course of at least the past year or so. Certainly has the talent to be able to back it up, but I don't think it's necessarily the thing that Disguised wants out of him, and I think he was getting a little bit more attention than maybe he was expecting in this series. And then Zazel and Meech just weren't all that great in the bot lane together, which is why I paired them together. But the jungle mid duo definitely was a positive for Disguised. I think both Young and Tomio, Young especially, I think had some really good moments in this series, especially in that game #1. So there are positives, some negatives. It's exactly really what you wanted to see out of this team to start off the split. Good and bad. You're going to see what could work. You're going to see what could go wrong. It's all about weeding out some of those errors and getting to a point where you can be more consistent. But for Team Liquid, I think they proved why I had them #1 in my power rankings in this series. They look like the best team in the NACL right now, especially if this mid-jungle duo is going to continue to be this good. And then you've got the final series of day #1 here, kind of the big ending off of the week, with no 6th series of the day. This one gets coverage on its own, which I think is really, really fun. And in this one, we had Maryville University taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, and EGC taking the 2-0 series win. Really good stuff from Evil Geniuses. I was higher on this team going into the split. I had them 5th in my power rankings when I saw a lot of other people putting them as low as like 8th in their power rankings, and I just didn't want to give up on the talent on this team. I know they haven't exactly been all that good in 2023 so far, especially a player like Shaden, who has a ridiculous amount of potential, or Soul up in the top lane. Smoothie hasn't been all that great. There are definitely concerns about this team, but the talent level in terms of what they've been able to produce in the past is very high, and I think they definitely showed that off in this first series. My player of the series is going to go to Ryoma. Got a lot of pushback, more than I expected, for putting Ryoma higher up in my mid lane rankings. I knew the mid lane rankings were in general just going to be a little bit controversial, but I think Ryoma more than deserves the placement that he ended up getting in that list, and obviously started off this season really, really hot. I think Ryoma's one of those players that if you surround him with good talent, he's going to look like one of the best mid laners in the region, and I think that's more than you can say about some of these other players who are a little bit less proven. I trust him quite a bit. I think Tommy doesn't get nearly the kind of credit he deserves for how good he has been, for how long he has been good. I know people kind of look at some of those 100 Thieves, LCS days and are like, he wasn't really able to hold up at that level, but people ignore what he's been able to do here in Tier 2 for a very long time, which is be a top 1 or 2 mid laner, basically for 2.5 straight years at this point, and so really happy to see him continue to play well. He was far from the only player. I thought Shaden had a really good series here for Evil Geniuses, and that's going to be a big litmus test for whether or not this team is going to be able to win games. We know how talented Shaden is. There was a reason Evil Geniuses were willing to give up Tomio to go and get him, and that's because they felt like he had bigger upside, and I think a lot of people, me included, thought that as well going into the year. Obviously, Obviously, Tomio is a really good player, but Shaden is going to dictate whether or not this team can be a contender or not, because if he can really step up and be someone that, this team can go to and really play around, that's massive, because talent-wise, he's going to be able to win you games. It's just about the consistency. And then again, King was actually really good in finally, his debut here in 2023. He never really got to play. He never got to play at all in spring because of visa complications, and so mobility was the starting AD carry for Evil Genius's last split. Good to see King back in. He's a big upgrade to this team. I think adding someone like that, someone who not only has LCS experience, but again, very similar to Ryoma, has just been a very good player in Tier 2 for a very long time, and I think that him adding on to this team is going to be a positive. He was very good in this first series. Same thing for Smoothie, looked relatively good, didn't have to do a whole ton, but looked good doing it, and then Soul was fine on the top side, didn't have to be the big carry, but was good enough. And then, unfortunately for Maryville on the other side, this was about as disastrous of a start to your NACL split as you could possibly get. Evil Geniuses is probably a team they wanted to go in and at least try to beat, but they were just not in the same ballpark, if I'm being honest. This was the least close series of the day, and I think a lot of that was on the mid lane gap, quite frankly. My dud of the series is going to go to Get Back. Still think he can be a relatively interesting player. I thought his floor was going to be a little bit higher than what we saw in day number 1, I should say here, but he really got outclassed. Like, him versus Ryoma was not close at all. Ryoma just kind of styled all over him, and that's okay. It's his first ever game at the NACL level. There are so many players that are now really, really good at this level that I think really struggled at the beginning, really struggled to transition. I think Yukino definitely comes to mind as a player like that, but, there's more than enough time for Maryville to figure it out and get back on their feet. But I thought Zyko, Odd Orange, like, those players also, quite frankly, just got outplayed in terms of what they were able to put out. I think Maryville definitely has some question marks. We thought that they were going to be a team with a high floor, a team that obviously has a lot of chemistry together because there was no roster swaps, but we were kind of hoping to see a good version of them to start the split, and I think we all thought they had maybe a little bit less upside to grow as a unit than some of these other teams, and so to see them kind of get blasted on day number 1, it's a little bit concerning. Obviously, still plenty of time to turn it around, but really good for Evil Geniuses. This is basically exactly how you wanted to start your split. That's going to bring us to day number 2 now of week number 1. Of course, still a 3-day week here in the NACL, and so we are moving on to the second day, and it was an interesting second day. To kick us off, in one of our first series, we had a matchup between Wildcard Gaming and Evil Geniuses Challengers that, a little bit surprisingly, Wildcard is able to dominate and take the series 2-0. Really didn't see this one coming. I thought Evil Geniuses showed a lot of good things. Of course, they did play a little bit of a weaker team, especially in terms of what they were able to output on day number 1 in Maryville, but Wildcard didn't look dominant in their series against AoE. Honestly, I thought AoE looked better, and we'll get to that a little bit later. AoE continuing to look good later in this day, but Wildcard looking really good in this opening series. Really like what we saw out of a lot of these players, and most specifically from the players that I think struggled the most on day 1, most notably the bot lane, who I think was really good. But my player of the series is going to be in the jungle position. It's going to go to Keel, who I thought was really good. Obviously, I've been hyping up Keel for quite a long time on Wildcard, which isn't going to be a surprise to people who have watched the channel all split long, or all year long, I should say. Keel, in my opinion, was the best player on Wildcard in spring. Certainly the player that I think advanced the team the most, and I expect that to continue here in summer, especially with Moose Hater gone. You don't have that, like, super feast or famine in the top lane. I think a player like Zamudo is going to be at least a little bit more consistent, which I said earlier on in the year, but Keel is still going to be someone who's going to be able to consistently generate leads because he just plays his champions better than anybody else plays their champions at this role. I'm not saying he's objectively the best jungler, but honestly, he's pretty damn close with how he's played in the last few weeks. He's been really, or last few months, really, he's been really, really good for this team. And then Lens and Duo King, a much better series here against Evil Geniuses than what they had against AoE, and you really like to see that, especially Lens, who's going to be a big part of what this team is going to be able to do, assuming they do get Isles back. He's going to need to step up. He's going to need to be able to dominate and carry games in a meta like the current one that we're in, and I thought he was a lot better at that in this series. Duo King was certainly more consistent. I didn't even think he was awful in that first day. He was just really bad on the Milio in that game number 1. Clearly, he's figured something out because the other games this week were really, really good from him. But for Evil Geniuses on the other side, basically the opposite. Not very good from them. Done of the series, easy choice. It's going to go to Ryoma. I was just hyping you up, man. You can't just come out and go 1-13 against Wildcard. That's not exactly what we were looking for. But again, this is just kind of what you get with mid laners in the NACL is a lack of consistency. There are quite a few that have been good and then have really bad moments. Now, a lot of the bad moments aren't usually this bad. This was just a horrendous series, inexplainable horrendous series, but I got to take that into account. Ryoma did not look good, and, it's certainly going to affect my opinion of him, although we kind of knew that he had this in him. He's done this a couple of times over the past year, and then Shaden, I also think, wasn't particularly good in this series. It seems like when one of them struggles, the other is almost certainly going to struggle as well. I think this team needs both of them to perform at a relatively high level, and like I said, Keel was just the better jungler in this series by a consistent margin. Shaden was just not able to keep up, and so definitely a disappointing performance from Evil Geniuses after what they showed on day one, but a really good one here for Wildcard. And then moving on to our other first series of the day, and this was the one I think, again, a lot of people were really excited to see, another top-of-the-table clash, as we saw Disguised taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and it's another 1-1 split. This is what we want to see. We want to see both teams performing at a high level, and honestly, I think Disguised looked much better here on day 2 than they did on day 1. This was a game that I did commentate live on my Twitch. Again, link is in the description if you want to check that out. I'll be tweeting when that goes live, but, they looked a lot better, I think, in this series, and I think they looked a lot more cohesive. I think that really is going to be the big takeaway, the big positive from these teams, is that I think pretty much everybody looked good across this series. There were a couple of players that I don't think stepped up nearly as much as some others, maybe some mistakes that need to be reeled in a little bit more, but I think these two teams are just really, really talented, and we saw that in this series. Let's talk about my player of the series, Fake God, first and foremost, because that game, too, was just spectacular on the Renekton. He was definitely the better top laner in this series, and that's a really good thing to see. I think Fake God is one of those players that is just always going to be a top-level player at this level, is never going to get the recognition that he deserves. He has been great for pretty much every team and every org that he has played for, and while he wasn't able to be, fantastic in the LCS on Dignitas, at least recently, he wasn't nearly as bad as I think people gave him credit for, and so I would generally say that Fake God is just a really, really good top laner for this level, and he absolutely deserves player of the series. Some other players to point out on the side of DSG, Zazel, I thought had a really good series for Disguised. He almost got my player of the series. He was really fun to watch. And then Young, I think, continues to impress me as a mid laner. I know people aren't really talking about him a lot. He's the one player that I think is getting the least amount of coverage on this team, but I don't think that that's fair. I think he's been relatively good to start this split and certainly more consistent than people are giving him credit for, but it wasn't perfect. I do think that while Meech was good across this entire series, and man, does he do damage, his aggressive mentality can sometimes be a little bit too much, and that's going to be an issue for this team against the best teams in the league, which we've seen against both Team Liquid and FlyQuest. Now, how many teams are actually going to be able to take advantage of that? I don't know, because Meech is probably going to smurf against every team that he is just simply better than in the entire league, and so I'm not really super worried about that, but we have seen moments in these series against Team Liquid, against FlyQuest, where his aggressive nature, where his playmaking nature can get him into a little bit of trouble. That's really the only negative that I can give DSG, though. I thought Fake God in particular was fantastic, but Zazel was great. I think Young was really good as well. And then for FlyQuest on the other side, a lot of positives to take away from them. I mean, winning that game number 1 was really good, and I think a lot of that was off the back of Masu playing really well. What a shock, Masu being really good. He was another player that I definitely considered for player of the series here. I think he was probably the most consistent across both games, but I think Fake God's performance in game 2 was the best single performance, and so I ended up going with him, but Masu was also still really good for this FlyQuest team, and he's going to continue to be a big asset for them. Yuji continues a really hot start to the split. He was probably the better jungler in this series, which is definitely a positive, but it wasn't all positives. I still think the solo laners for FlyQuest haven't exactly been as hot as I think we wanted them to be to start the split. Faisal's going to get my dud of the series here. He just wasn't as good as Fake God in the top lane. It was a little bit of a top gap, especially in that second game, and then Spearex really has not been the player that I think we really wanted to see to start the split. Now, that's not to say he can't turn into that, and I don't think he's making any egregious, major errors. I just don't think he's been a huge positive for this team, and I think you could say the same thing for Faisal. Really, the only reason that they're going to be getting, my dud of the series kind of crowns here is because I don't think anybody played particularly bad this series. They just were the least effective players on their teams, and I think that's pretty fair to say, but overall, this was definitely a matchup between two of the top teams. FlyQuest looks good, especially Masu and Winsome, who continue to look great, and Yuji, who's had a great start to the split, and then Disguised is just a really talented team, especially if they can rein in Meech, kind of get him on a little bit more of a consistent basis. I think this team is going to be near impossible to beat. And then moving on to our second group of games here from day number 2, kicking it off with a matchup between Supernova and AoE Gold. That AoE is able to take 2-0. Really nice win from a team that honestly looks really good to start the split in a lot of different areas. I think in their first series in day number 1, we were talking about the bot lane really stepping up. Lynx and Breezy looking really, really good in that series and definitely being able to create a lot of advantages for this team. And in this second day, I think we're talking about that mid-jungle duo, which really needed to be a big factor for them. And man, was it a big factor in this series. My player of the series is going to go to Dark Wings in the mid lane, just a really, really good player, someone who I'm obviously very high on, but can be relatively inconsistent. I think you're hoping that that shores up now that you've brought in a player like Will into the jungle who's been nothing but very good at this level, and at least in this series, it looked exactly how you would want it to. Dark Wings was fantastic, dominating that mid lane matchup 1v1 and then translating that to a ridiculous amount of damage outside of that as well. His game one was just about as good as you could possibly have had it, and then Will was right there as well. I think Will definitely deserves to be in this conversation for player of the series in that same vein. He looked really good. This was kind of the big, like, oh, I'm still here moment from Will, at least for me. Yes, you are. You are definitely still here, and you're definitely someone that we have to continue to pay attention to because he was really, really good in this series. And then Breezy. Breezy's had a great start to the split for AoE, just been a consistently great support at this level. I'm going to continue to be high on him until he gives me any reason not to be. I don't really even think that there was a player on AoE that I would consider not, playing up to expectations. Everybody was relatively good. Concept, we'll talk about it, was maybe not the better top laner in this series, but he wasn't exactly causing problems for his team. I just think the mid-jungle duo for AoE was so strong that it really did push them across the finish line. And then for Supernova on the other side, unfortunately, they were not nearly as good in this series. Game 2 was definitely a lot better. There were definitely good moments for them in game number 2, a lot of them coming through top lane and coming through Quacker, who honestly did impress me quite a bit. He wasn't great on day 1, but I thought he was awesome on day 2. He was definitely one of the better players in this series and almost dragged his team across the finish line. Really good stuff from him, but the rest of the team was just not up for the effort. My dud of the series is going to go to Robbie Bob in the mid lane. I'm a little bit worried about him, not because he's had bad performances to start this split, but because, I really haven't seen him play all that well at this level before. He played for Evil Geniuses for a bit before Ryoma was able to get his visa and come back last split. Wasn't very good for them, has not started out hot here, and so there definitely are question marks about the middle of the map, I think, for Supernova. He's got the talent to be able to figure it out. We've seen what he's been able to do at lower levels. It's just not translated to the NACL yet, and then I think the bot lane was definitely not nearly as good in this series as they were against Taco on day 1. Sketch in particular, I think, took a pretty big step back here on day number 2, just not nearly as explosive. Trevor wasn't nearly as good in lane, which I think was a little bit of a problem. I still have faith that the bot lane is going to be fine and be a good, part of this team, but I don't think day 2 was exactly the day for them, if we're being entirely honest. But like I said, Quacker was actually really good in the top lane, and I don't think Music had a particularly bad series here for Supernova. I just don't think that they were able to kind of outlast a team that I think is probably just a little bit more talented than what they're able to handle, and that really is what AoE is at the moment. They are an actually good team, potentially even a top 4 team in the NACL. They've kind of performed like it through the first couple of days, and so that's something to keep an eye on, something that we're definitely going to be monitoring. But Dark Wings and Will, if they can get on the same page, that's going to be massive, and then of course if this bot lane can continue to be good, that's going to be big as well. Just a very consistent team that I think I'm really starting to like a lot. And then the other of the second series games here on day number 2, and this one was also not particularly close. We had a match between Maryville University and Team Liquid Challengers, and it went about as you would expect after how day 1 went. TL was able to dominate this series and come out on top relatively efficiently. This team is just stacked at this level. I know people are going to continuously complain about the age of some of the players on Team Liquid, whether it be Mir, whether it be Arrow, and I want to make it clear where I stand on that issue, which is that the best players who want to play should play. Like, that is really just how it is. It doesn't really matter what your age is. I understand this idea that comes from traditional sports of, players aging out and being on the decline, but really, if you're willing to play 16 hours a day or whatever, right? Like, 10, 11, 12 hours a day still, you can still get better at the game. Like, you're never going to stop getting better. Now, yes, it's going to be harder when you're older because your reflexes are a little bit slower and yada, yada, yada. There's obviously some science behind it, but if Arrow is still better than any other AD carry, if Mir is still better than any other jungler that you could have in that spot, why would you not go for them? Why would you not see what you have in them? And so, I absolutely agree that Team Liquid is the best team in the league at the current moment, and I think they proved it here. Player of the series, though, is none of that. The player of the series is absolutely APA, who continues to just brutalize everyone that he goes up against. Not really a sneaky take here at all, but this dude's gonna win MVP. Like, there really isn't a lot that stands in his way from being the most valuable player in the NACL to his team, and he certainly started off the year in a pretty dominant fashion. I mean, he's pulling out Twisted Fate and doing 8,000 damage in a team fight. Like, yeah, APA is pretty darn good at the game of League of Legends. He's just better than everybody he's going up against, even on the best teams at this ELO, which gives me so much confidence that he's just going to continue to be an absolute beast. He was awesome this series, and so were Arrow and Kim Down, who continue to be a really good bot lane, if not one of the most consistent ones in the NACL. You know, they're right up there with the FlyQuest Challenger bot lane. I know that there are a lot of higher upside bot lanes in the league, and I still do believe that, but like consistency-wise, yeah, Team Liquid's right there with them, and they can continue to be a big asset. The top side of this map is Bradley and Mir. It's still really freaking good, arguably the two best players in their role. This team is stacked and loaded, and they're playing like it right now, just at a really, really high level. And then for Maryville, they're not, unfortunately. We were kind of hoping for a strong start, like we said, from a team like Maryville, but it's kind of been the opposite. This team has just not been very good to kick off the split. They got destroyed by Evil Geniuses. They get destroyed here by Team Liquid. Yes, it's two LCS affiliated orgs that have had a little bit more time to mesh together as a team because there wasn't this big roster turnover in the mid-year, but Maryville is in that same boat. There wasn't any roster turnover. You would have hoped this team, I think, would show up a little bit better, and I think a big concern is Get Back in the mid lane, who really has not had a good start to his NACL career. Again, I want to stress this enough. The first 4 games of your NACL time do not define who you are as a player. You can have a rough start and figure it out as you go along in the split. It's week number 1, so I don't want to make any generalizations or overreact at all, but what I do want to say is that Get Back has not been particularly good in week number 1 up until this point. He's been a big black hole for Maryville in the first couple of games where mid lane pressure is just not available to them, which is going to be a problem. But another problem has been that Scary Jerry has not been able to translate, and that was a concern going into the split. That was something that I think we all were a little bit worried about. He had never really played consistently against, you know, players of this caliber, I would say, like Arrow before this split, like King before this split, and when he did, it didn't really go all that well. He liked to skill check his opponents, and he's just not going to be able to do that as consistently here at this level, and I think we're seeing a little bit of the problem with that. Now, I do want to say, I think Zyko, while he didn't have a good day number 1, I thought he was much better in day number 2, had a couple of circumstances where I actually thought he played some team fights particularly well, and then I think Niles in the top lane is still a fine player at this level, but I'm worried about Maryville. I'm worried about the outlook of this team overall, because really, if we're looking at them in a couple of weeks as like the worst team in the NACL with how they're playing right now, I'm not going to be surprised. In fact, they might already be there, especially with how some of the other teams in this league have kind of overperformed expectations. And so for me, Maryville not looking great, but Team Liquid looking just about as good as we could have expected. And then our final series here of day number 2, and it was another intriguing one and a 1-1 split between Team Fish Taco and the Cincinnati Fear. And like I said, a 1-1 split is probably not in favor of the Fear. They probably wanted to be able to walk out of the series with a 2-0 win against a team that I think a lot of people kind of expected them to beat, and I hate to say it, I'm kind of in that camp as well. Not to say that I'm quote-unquote disappointed or anything like that in them. I think they're starting off a little bit slower than I would have expected them to, considering that they're kind of bringing back the core of this team with Perry, with Shochi, and with Manui, but it hasn't quite clicked in that same way that I think it did in spring. Let's go ahead and talk about Taco first, though, because I actually think they played really well in this series, and there's a lot of players that I want to shout out in a positive light for them. Most notably, the kind of, I guess, supportive positions, if you want to call them that, Rosethorn and NXI, who I think have been really good for this team. Well, Rosethorn has been up and down, I would say, across the first 2 days. He's going to get my player of the series, though, on day number 2 here. It felt like he had a lot of control over this series. His game number 1 was good, but his game number 2 was definitely the best of anybody on Taco, and I think, especially when you're looking at the series as a whole, he was easily the most consistent player, and I think that's why he's going to get this for me, but you have no idea how much I wanted to give this player of the series award to NXI, who I just think was really good on the recon in game number 1. He wasn't quite as dominant in that game number 2, where I think there were just a few more hiccups, but you know, his recon in game number 1, in my opinion, was player of the game in game number 1. Just a super fun one from NXI. And I think when you're looking at him as a player, like, I was concerned about how his role swap to support was actually going to work out. Was this going to be something that they were going to regret because there were so many good supports that were teamless going into the split? But NXI has been crazy aggressive. He leads every player in the NACL in KP percentage, at least after week number 1. And it definitely shows when you watch the games. He's not afraid to take and engage. He's not afraid to try and find a fight, and man, did it absolutely work out for him in this series and in game number 1 in particular. But Rosethorn was also really good on the engagers, on the Wukong, on the Vi. Really good stuff, I would say, coming out from those two, and I think Spawn is honestly underrated in terms of the consistency he offers. We know he's a good player, and everybody kind of knows that he's a top-ish support, or I should say AD carry in the NACL, but I just don't think his name gets brought up enough. He had another really good series, especially that game number 1, and unfortunately, there was one player that I do want to call out on the side of Taco not playing great, and that was actually Lunacia. And we talked about this at the beginning of the split. The inconsistency from Lunacia is definitely something to be at least least a little bit worried about the fact that, you know, he can have these really big highlight moments, these really big pop-off plays, but it's not always going to be the most consistent thing in the world, and I don't think it was in this series. I honestly think Philip was better on the side of Fear, which is a really good side for Fear. We'll talk about that in a second. The top side of the map was actually pretty solid for them, but, you know, Lunasi is definitely something we're going to keep an eye on, you know, for Taco. I think that if he can continue to grow and get a little bit more consistent, this team is going to be able to win, and I think, honestly, you know, there was an opportunity for them to take this series 2-0 here, and they weren't able to do it. I'm not blaming it on Lunasi or anything, but bot's side of the map was definitely a little bit stronger, in my opinion. And then for Fear on the other side, couple of positives, couple of negatives. Dud of the series is again going to go to Manui in the AD carry position. You just need to see more out of that role right now. I'm not blaming everything on him because it's certainly not only his problem. There are a lot of things that are going wrong for Fear right now, and, you know, to blame an AD carry for the fact that, you know, he's not going to be able to be put in a position to carry games, it's not always going to be his fault. However, this is very similar to what we saw at the beginning of spring, where it just doesn't look like he's comfortable in the lineup right now. It feels like he's playing a little bit scared, and I think that is definitely translating into a little bit more of a problem for Fear overall. I think Perry was actually really good this series, and I think that there is a case to be made that Perry, you know, was definitely the player of the game of game number 2. I just don't think that the bot side of the map stepped up nearly as much as it needed to. I'm not sure if it's the connection between Manui and JJ, who I think JJ played much better in day number 2 here, or what it is, or if he's just a little bit, you know, worried about maybe messing up at this level. Like, he needs to play with the confidence that he had towards the back half of last split. That's really where he's going to unlock a lot of that mechanical prowess that we know he has, and I think the rest of this team is doing well. Philip had a good series. Shochi's been really solid. Maybe not, like, crazy, like, explosive plays, but he's certainly not been a problem for this team at all, and he was good in game number 2, very good in game number 2, but I think if this bot lane can step up and be what they were last split with the addition of JJ here, I think that is going to solve a lot of the things for Fear overall. So definitely still a lot of fight in this team, but it's not nearly been as strong of a start as I think they were probably looking forward to. And then Taco on the other side, I think, is the opposite. This team has actually looked really good to start the split, a lot better than I think I was expecting them to. They've got a tough test on day number 3, but so far through the first couple of days, they look very competitive. And that's going to bring us to our third and final day here in week number 1 of the NACL, and we've got a lot more good games. Again, everybody playing every day makes it certainly interesting now to see how these teams progress, and we kicked off day 3 with probably the most interesting game of the day. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on FlyQuest Challengers, kind of completing this triangle that all of these teams played each other, TL, Fly, and Disguised all playing each other in week number 1, and Team Liquid coming out on top with a 2-0 series win, not dropping a single game here to FlyQuest, and I think really cementing themselves as the best team in the NACL right now. Really happy to have been on board with that before the season started, where it didn't feel like that was the most popular opinion in the world. It definitely feels like that has been an opinion that has definitely worked out for me, at least so far, and this team just feels very complete. It feels like they don't really have any weakness at all. Bradley is super solid on the top lane. You can make an argument that he's the best carry top laner in the league. Fake God, you know, obviously in that conversation as well. We'll talk about him a bit later in this day, but Mir and APA are probably almost certainly the 2 best players in their roles in the NACL, and Mir was sensational here, and then Arrow and Kimdown are more than solid as a bot lane duo, and so really like what TL has been able to do. Mir is going to get my player of the series in this one. That Graves game in game number 2 was a blast. I saw someone comment, the Graves on the enemy team. That's exactly what Mir was in this series. The MVP is definitely bouncing back relatively well, and it's good to see him and APA have ridiculous chemistry together. I think a lot of times, for me, APA gets undervalued in terms of that duo, but both of them are just as good, and I think both of them are LCS caliber players and could really dominate at that level if they were given the opportunity, like be high-level players at that level if given the opportunity. Mir is a very good carry player. APA can kind of do whatever you need him to do. APA also had a really good series. I don't know if I said that. And then, honestly, I almost gave player of the series to Kimdown in the support position because, you know, we'll talk about this in the series after this as well, but there have been a lot of bad Milio players over the course of this week so far in the NACL. This is a champion that everybody's talking about being ridiculously broken, but there has definitely been a barrier of execution in terms of what supports at this level have been able to do with him, and Kimdown played him at a super high level in this series, so I almost gave him player of the series for that, but Mir was just a little bit more consistent. APA really good, Arrow good, Bradley good, TL's good. As for FlyQuest, it's definitely disappointing that they dropped a series here 0-2, not really what you expected, and I think a lot of it is going to be the fact that Masu just wasn't all that good in this series, and I know there's obviously, you know, some regression that might be expected expected from a player after the breakout split that he had, but honestly, I wasn't really expecting any because his mechanics and his mental were all kind of there already. I just kind of felt that his upward trajectory were going to continue to be there, but this was one of the worst series that we've seen him play in the NACL, and that's fine. Again, it's week number 1. The one thing I don't want to do is overreact and try to make these big inflammatory statements about any of these players. Masu is allowed to have a bad couple of games, not even bad, just a not exceptional couple of games, and against, Arrow, who's a former MVP of the LCS. Like, you're allowed to do that, especially when Mirror is super fed, when APA is playing really well. It's just a little bit concerning that he wasn't great in this series against a team that they really needed to beat. This was something that was a little bit of a concern in the playoffs as well, so something to keep an eye on. Faisal also has just not meshed well with this team up until this point. He was huge for Fear last split, but it just doesn't feel like it's the same on FlyQuest, which is a little bit concerning. Obviously, again, gonna give him some time to try and mesh with the rest of the team, but he's been playing a lot of weak side, and he's honestly been taken advantage of for it in lane. Bradley was just much better in the 1v1 in the top lane in this series, and I think that that was pretty clear. But overall, I would say both teams still looking okay, just Team Liquid coming out looking a lot better. And then the second of the first bracket of games here on day number 3 is another pretty intriguing one that did not go how I expected it to. We had Evil Geniuses challengers taking on AoE Gold, and EGC with another dominant win. I hate to say it, this is the exact same team from spring, isn't it? Like, as much as I don't want that to be the case, their inability to either be good or bad does concern me. Now, it is worth noting that down the stretch in spring, they were bad, and that was at least a choice that they made, but this is what was happening at the beginning of spring as well, where it's like this team can't decide whether or not it wants to be really good or really bad, because, there are times where they look like both. Evil Geniuses looked fantastic on day 1, they looked miserable on day 2, and now they look good again on day number 3. Maybe it's the challengers, but AoE Gold had been a team that looked really good up until this point in the split. So, I don't know. Evil Geniuses is definitely a team that I want to praise, though, and honestly, a lot of these players deserve a shout-out. My player of the series is going to go to Smoothie in the support position, which is not a player I think a lot of people are excited about at the NACL level, not someone who's shown a lot of things in recent years, but you know what? He's still a talented player. He's somebody who's been a very good support at the LCS level in the past for Cloud9, and someone who has definitely been good at this level before. He just wasn't very good in spring, but this was a good showing again. It's not always the hardest thing to do to pull off Milio and Yumi and look good doing it, but there were so many people in the NACL, I should say, this past week that just weren't able to do that, and so I gotta give credit where credit is due. Smoothie did make Milio look like a good champion, and so credit to him. He's gonna get player of the series. I think you could very realistically give this to Shaden in the jungle. Like I said, when Shaden plays well, this team's probably gonna win. When Shaden doesn't play well, this team is probably going to lose, and Shaden played well in this series, even going into another jungler who I think performed rather admirably. King, in that same vein, was really solid in the bot lane, and then I think Ryoma was also really good in the mid lane. Basically, everybody on Evil Geniuses performing up to their parts, and really, this was more of a team effort, I would say, than one individual player dominating. They were just the better team across the series, especially in Game 2, which was a blowout. And then, on the side of AoE, this is just not where I thought this was going to go. I thought AoE was going to be like, hey, no, actually, we're a really good team. We're going to be able to take down Evil Geniuses, and we're going to cement ourselves as potentially a top 4 team, but it just wasn't able to happen here. My dud of the series is going to go to Concept in the top lane, who just was not very good this series, and that's going to be a bit of a concern. Not that I think Concept is like a gigantic weak link for this team at all, but he's not someone who's really ever been a strong top laner at this level, and AoE, I think, does have the upside to be a very competitive team. There were other positives on this team, though. Will had another really good series, which I think is good to see. He was going into Shaden, so I'm willing to accept the fact that maybe he wasn't able to carry and take over in that same way from behind as a player like Shaden was going to be able to do, but Will was definitely the best player on AoE in this series. But I think the solo lanes were a problem. I already talked about Concept, but Darkwings was kind of on the low end of his spectrum, I would say, in this series. Still a lot of things that I think this team has the ability to fix, but wasn't exactly the showing that I think we all wanted to see from them after what was a really good first couple of days. And then for Evil Geniuses, inconsistently great. That's really what this team is. There are going to be days where they look untouchable, even against good teams, and there are going to be days where they look like where it's unwinnable for them, and you never really know which one you're going to get at any given moment, but at least right now, it looks pretty okay. And then moving on to our second grouping of games here on the final day, and we kicked it off with another series that I commentated on my Twitch. Again, third plug of the video down in the link below, but we had a matchup between Team Fish Taco and Disguise, DSG, and for the first time this split, DSG is able to come out on top in a 2-0 win. This is their first, series win, I guess you could say, but both of their draws were against arguably the two other best teams in the league, and so certainly not something you're going to be upset about. Disguise looking really, really good in week number 1, about as good as you could have expected a team of former Cloud9 players and then a bunch of really nice young prodigies in the carry roles to perform early on in this split. Really happy to see them be able to take the win over Taco, who actually performed relatively okay in this series. We'll kind of talk about that. They weren't as bad as they could have been in this series. I definitely think that there was a universe in which they just got completely blown out by DSG, but that really wasn't the case. DSG definitely had to work for it, and they were able to get it in the end, but wasn't exactly the cleanest series in the world, I guess I should say. Player of the series for me is going to go to Fake God in the top lane. He continues to be this team's best player right now, and I think that's a really big thing to continue to monitor for this team. If Fake God can continue to be that much of a problem in the top lane like he was across this entire series, that's going to be big for Disguise, because really, there aren't a lot of teams that have that kind of impact on the top side of the map. In the NACL, there are a lot of teams that have the potential to have that kind of impact, but none that have really done it consistently over the course of this year so far, and so DSG looking really good on that side of the map, and it's far from only him. I actually think this was probably the best series the bot lane had over the course of the first week, especially Meech, who I think has had a lot of good moments and also a lot of bad moments for this team. He's done a lot of damage, but he's also put himself in some pretty bad positions to deal that damage. I think this was his most consistent series by a significant margin. Still a couple of errors here or there, but he was a lot better in team fights, and I really do think that's what separated DSG in this series. You got to give a lot of credit to Zazel as well, who just continues to be a big positive factor for this team overall. I think those were the three players you really wanted to shout out, but Tomio and Young were definitely not slouches. Young was probably the least impactful player of this team in this series, but I actually think he's been underrated through the first couple of days, and so DSG just generally looking good overall. As for Taco on the other side, some good early games from this team, which I definitely think is nice and impressive, and certainly not something I expected from them going against a team like Disguised, but a couple of good positives. I think Spawn, especially in game number 1, looked really, really good. If only the team peeled for him in a lot of those crucial team fights, he probably would have had the opportunity to deal some damage, but wasn't meant to be. I still think he looked relatively good and was probably the most consistent member of Taco, as we all kind of expected going into the year, but a couple of the other players that have stepped up over the beginning part of the split were not quite as good here in the final day. NXI definitely jumps out as somebody who was really good at the start of the split and made a couple of pretty poor aggressive decisions in this series that ended up being a problem for Taco. Onat, I don't think was nearly as, explosive going up against a player like Young as he was against some of the other teams that he faced earlier on in the split. And then my dud of the series is going to be Lunacia in the top lane. Just got outplayed almost entirely by Fake God. Not really a great week 1 from Lunacia. Was definitely not the star of the show for Taco, but some pretty tough competition, especially in this final series, so I'm willing to give him a pass. But again, remember, I did this a lot in spring. Lunacia got a lot of dud of the series for me in spring because he's going to have a couple of games here or there where he's just not very good. And if you pair two of those back to back, that's going to be a little bit of a problem for Taco because they're really relying on him to be a big presence on the top side. Spawn is very good, but he's not that super carry kind of player. He needs somebody else on the team to be able to generate those leads, and you're kind of hoping that can be Lunacia. Rosethorn wasn't particularly great in this series either, but overall, Taco was fine. They certainly could have gone down a lot less easy than they did, but, I think for the most part, they were competitive. And then Disguised on the other side, looking good, ending the week, 1-2-0, that's 4 wins, which is really good. 4-2 is definitely a good place to be sitting after the strength of schedule that they had, and I think they're going to be pretty confident moving into the upcoming weeks. And then the other second series, I guess, of the day here on day number 3, it was a pretty interesting affair between Maryville University and the Cincinnati Fear that Maryville actually holds their own in. It's a 1-for-1 split. I expected the Fear to be able to come out and really put a stamp on this series. They should be able to beat a team like Maryville, who just doesn't look all that great in week number 1, but they weren't able to do that. It's a 1-1 split, and I think Maryville is going to be very happy with that outcome in general, mostly because I think they played this game, too, very well. I think very aggressive comps coming out from them. The Pantheon in the top lane, both games, is certainly something to keep an eye on, but in general, I think that aggression definitely paid off, and I think that game, too, was a lot of fun to watch from their side. My player of the series is going to go to Odd Orange in the jungle, who was somebody who I think a lot of people had some question marks about moving into kind of the NACL summer split, not because he had been playing bad recently, but because obviously he had been in the scene a while, and I think people are obviously less willing to give freedom to players who have had chances, even if they were very slim before. But Odd Orange Orange is a very good player, and he showed that off here. I think he has very good synergy with the rest of his teammates, and we talked about that, most specifically Niles in the top lane, who I think he plays off of incredibly well, but this was a really good series from him. He was just straight up better than Perry on the other side of the map, which is not something I expected in this series, but it's really good to see from him. He's someone who I think has been underrated as a very good player at the collegiate level for quite a long time, and now he's getting the chance to prove it again at tier 2, and I think he's definitely doing that. At least this series was really, really good from him, but he wasn't the only player on the team to play well. Niles was really good in that game number 2, was pretty miserable in that game number 1, where things were just not working out for him. Philip was actually having a really good game on the other side of the map, but, you know, when you're able to get that Pantheon rocking and rolling and in a much better spot, it's going to look a lot better, and I thought that game number 2 from Niles was definitely a standout performance. He was probably their player of the game in that game number 2, but Auto Orange was definitely the more consistent player over the course of the entire series. And then also a big shout out to Zyko. I really like him as a player. I talked him up really heavily before the split started in my pre-split power rankings. I thought Zyko was a player that people needed to really watch and pay attention to. And while I'm not going to say that, like, I'm basing this entirely off of that, I think the same tools that I saw in collegiate that really made me excited for him as a player are coming through here at this level, and I think that's definitely something to be excited about, even if it hasn't gone absolutely perfectly, especially for this bot lane as a whole. Still a little bit worried about the carry duo, but the ancillary pieces were definitely more than enough in this series. And then on the other side, Fear, there's some good. I think Shochi actually had a really good series here in the mid lane. He was probably the best performing member of this team. There were a couple of really good moments from him that I think definitely put Fear in a much better spot than they had been in a lot of the other games that they had played, but it just wasn't enough, especially in game number 2, and I'm starting to get a little bit concerned for this team. I don't mean to talk about it in such a negative manner, because trading 1-for-1 really is not bad here. Being able to take a game, you know, looking okay, you got 2 wins, 2-4, it's not like the worst record of all time, but I think we all just had better expectations for this team, and so it's disappointing to see them drop a game to, you know, what people consider maybe to be the worst team in the NACL right now, and Perry's gonna get my dud of the series because of it. Auto Orange, honestly, just out-jungled him in this series. Maybe not as much in game 1, but game 2 was a gap. Perry wasn't very good in that game number 2, and that's a little bit concerning. I'm not really sure what's going on. I'm not sure if it's a macro problem. I'm not sure if it's a communication problem. We know how vocal Trevor was for this team over the past split. You know, losing him could be a little bit of a problem for this team in terms of decision making, but JJ, that's always been a little bit of a strength for him, at least in terms of perception. I don't think Philip was all that good in game 2 either. Definitely kind of run over in the top lane by Niles on the other side, and that's definitely something to keep in mind. Philip, someone who's been a little bit inconsistent over the course of 2023, but, you know, if Shochi's going to step up, the rest of the team does need to follow. I have faith that players like Perry are going to be able to figure it out, but the bot lane is going to be a question mark until they can prove otherwise, and, you know, the top lane I think is good, but is it going to be as good as Faisal was for this team last split? That's going to be a question that they need to continue to answer. It was a good win for them. Game number 1 was really good, but they have to be able to do it more consistently. And then for Maryville, nice to pick up their first win of the year here in game number 2. There is definitely a lot of up still to go, but, you know, when you're at the bottom, typically all you can go is up. And then bringing us to our last series of the final day here of week number 1, we had a matchup between Supernova and Wildcard Gaming that Supernova was able to take 2-0. This is another pretty shocking result. Again, Wildcard not exactly looking dominant in the first couple series, but not exactly looking bad either. To see Supernova just come out and beat them is certainly a surprise here, and honestly, we'll get to the power rankings after this section. It is a nightmare to try and power rank these teams with how week 1 ended up going. Everybody beat everybody. I don't know who's good. We'll talk about that later, but good for Supernova. Really nice win for them. They kind of needed this. They weren't exactly looking the most dominant of all the teams, at least to start the split, and so really good to see a lot of the players that I think we saw upside for really step up. The 3 players in particular that I was highlighting at the beginning of the split as being big factors towards whether or not Supernova was going to outperform my number 10 expectation that I had for them in those power rankings all stepped up in this series, and most specifically my player of the series, Music, coming in the jungle. I talked about not knowing a ton about him, but he was actually really good in week number 1 for this team. The most consistent player, I would say, across every series. Maybe Sketch could get that award as well, because he was really good, but Music was definitely an impressive member of this team, looked really good in this series overall, was definitely better than a good jungler in Keel on the other side of the map, someone who has not really been shut down by a lot of other junglers at this level, so to see him perform as well as he did into him was definitely a good sign, and somebody who I know a lot of people have really high hopes for, so if he can live up to those hopes and expectations, Supernova is going to be a dangerous team But the bot lane was also really good for this team, and that was the avenue that I was most looking for with Supernova. Sketch and Trevor, two really good players for this level that I was really hoping would be able to come together and create in the same way that maybe like Manui and Trevor were able to do in the previous split. And honestly, it looks pretty good. And Trevor, I looked pretty good for ranking him as high as I did in my support rankings, because it just feels like whatever team he ends up going to ends up benefiting a lot from having him on as a player, and I think that will continue. Sketch continues to look really good as a carry for this team, as someone that can pump resources into and kind of expect to be able to carry them across the finish line in the mid to late game, and if that's the case, this team is going to be very dangerous to deal with for the rest of the split. Music, Trevor, Sketch, all looking really good. The rest of the pieces are also good. Quacker had a very good game too. Robbie Bob has had some up and down moments, I would say, overall, but is still relatively good. There are positives for this Supernova team, but I think in general, they look pretty good right now. And then for Wildcard on the other side, they did not look good in this series. Honestly, they kind of got blasted, especially in that game number 1. It was not close at all. My dud of the series is going to go to Saligo in the mid lane. One of the worst performances that he's had in quite a while. Very funny how he kind of dominates Ryoma in the previous day and then kind of gets bodied by Robbie Bob here, who kind of got bodied by Darkwings, and etc., etc. When I talk about mid laners in the NACL not being consistent, this is what I'm talking about. Everybody beats everybody, and that's just kind of how it ends up working. You can see why it's hard for me to power rank that position, but Saligo was not particularly good in this series, didn't really get a lot done, was mostly a negative, not really any pressure coming out of the mid lane, which is never going to be good, especially in a matchup where the enemy jungler is doing so much on the map, really not a lot of counterplay coming out from Wildcard. I still think they're a decent team, but Zamudo had a much rougher performance, I would say, in this matchup, going into Quacker, who definitely showed some good things in week number 1, and I think in general, I just have Wildcard written down as kind of a dud in this series. Nobody really looking all that good on the side of Wildcard. Definitely their weakest performance of week number 1, but it's something that can be rectified. Like, they can figure this out, they can get back to a better spot, and I think that they probably will. I still have faith in this team, but Supernova, really like the positives that we've seen out of them. They've just got to be able to keep it up. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 1 overview and analysis of all 3 days of action. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings after week number 1. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power ranking number for the team. In the second column to the right, you're going to see how that has changed from last week to this week. So let's go ahead and go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. Top 3 are staying the same. I know people might want to see some sort of movement, but pretty much everything went as expected for me. Team Liquid is number 1. I think that is clear. And the difference between Disguised and Fly is not big enough to make any sort of change. I think Disguised, in fact, might be even better. Fly not necessarily doing as well against Team Liquid, but both of those teams are incredibly close. That's your top 3 in the NACL at the current moment. But movement after that, we've got Evil Geniuses jumping up to number 4. Their upside is incredible. When they play well, they are right up there with the best teams in the league, but I just don't expect them to be able to do it as consistently as the top 3. I have them right on the outskirts of that. AoE jumping up to number 5. Will and Darkwings looking good. Will in particular looking really solid. Breezy had a really great week number 1, and that's, all those things I think are very encouraging things for this team, even if they weren't able to close it out on day number 3. And then number 6 is going to be the Cincinnati Fear, falling all the way down to number 6. They could fall a lot further. They were not the number 6 team in the league on week number 1, I should say. Hopefully they're able to kind of fix that and kind of get back to a point where they can be higher. I'm still giving them a lot of respect because these players are incredibly talented, and I don't think that they're playing up to their potential right now, but they're good players. Wildcard falling down to 7 because of that. Just a very inconsistent week coming out from Wildcard. I really don't know what to think of them at the moment. Taco and Supernova moving up 1 spot each. Taco moving up to 8, Supernova up to 9, because Maryville's going to drop down to number 10. They look clearly like the worst team in the league at the current moment, and it's really hard for me to think otherwise. Obviously, this team does have upside, but I think they honestly right now look like they have less upside than the rest of the teams, and so this is my power rankings. Let me know if you guys differ down in the comments section below. Of course, it's time for my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week was a pretty easy choice for me in this one. It is going to go to APA on Team Liquid Challengers. Just a fantastic week from APA in general. He's just a fantastic player for a team that really is streaking very, very hard right now, and it would be hard-pressed for me to find a player that performed better. Fake God was definitely in consideration for this, but to me, it was a pretty easy choice to end up going with APA for my player of the week in week number 1. one. And my dud of the week, unfortunately, I have to give that out as well. And this one was also a relatively easy choice. Unfortunately, it's going to go to Get Back on Maryville. Just not a very good week from the mid laner on Maryville. A lot of things to improve upon, although I do think he can improve upon them. He is somebody who has shown good things in the past at the collegiate level. Maybe he just needs a little bit more time. It's okay to have a little bit of a rough week number one, but I do have to point out that week number one, dud of the week, is going to go to Get Back. Week one, player of the week is going to go to APA, but that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comment section below, and of course, leave a like if you did enjoy the video. It helps me, lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which is always very helpful. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, but we do post about it every single week. We cover all 4 of the major regions every single week as well, so if you're interested in that kind of content, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell. If you were enjoying this video, then you're probably going to enjoy a lot of the rest of the content that I put out as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.